Welcome. Welcome to today's large group panel on what does comprehensive literacy look like for students with extensive support needs. I'm Gail Gear, and I'm with the TIES Center. I'm a researcher with the TIES Center. And the TIES Center is a National Technical Assistance Center for inclusive policies and practices with a particular focus on students with significant cognitive disabilities. And I'll be the moderator for today's panel. We are very pleased to have three terrific presenters today. Each will talk about an aspect of teaching students with extensive support needs, comprehensive literacy. This panel is really significant because it focuses on the evidence-based practices for comprehensive literacy for this group of students who often don't receive this the full range of literacy instruction. And under this umbrella, with kids with significant support needs, we also have kids with significant cognitive disabilities. They're kind of a large subgroup of that under that umbrella. So, and then as a part of it also, research is showing great outcomes for kids in this group and being in inclusive settings, being educated in inclusive settings. So you'll see the linkage between comprehensive inclusive literacy instruction in inclusive settings. So first, just in terms of just some logistics, please enter any questions into the box that's on your screen. If you're any early, you know that that's kind of how it's done, and we'll be monitoring them and be hoping we can respond to them as we go along, that the presenters will be able to just answer your questions at the end of each of their talks. So first we're going to hear, let's get kind of an overview of the panel for today. First, we're going to hear from Dr. Karen Erickson, professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where she is a director of the Center for Literacy and Disability Studies. She is speaking to us today about comprehensive emergent conventional literacy, teaching students with extensive support needs to read and write. And it looks at the full continuum of kids and what does that look like and how do we meet their needs. Then we're going to hear from Dr. Shawnee Wakeman. Dr. Wakeman is a clinical professor in special education and child development at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. She is also a TIES Center partner. She is speaking on comprehensive literacy, best practices for classrooms for students with extensive support needs. And our final presenter is Ashley Davies from the South Carolina Department of Education. Ms. Davies is a former special education teacher who is now with the Department of Ed in South Carolina. She's their 619 coordinator and is a project manager for South Carolina's Partnership for Inclusion. And her presentation is Comprehensive Literacy and Implementation. How will this work? So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Karen and have Karen start sharing today. So welcome, Karen.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here today to talk about a topic that is near and dear to me. In fact, I am sitting in a hotel room having just run back from spending a day collecting data on with teachers who are implementing comprehensive literacy instruction with their students with extensive support needs in the schools. I'm Karen Erickson. I'm at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I'm the director of a research center, the Center for Literacy and Disability Studies. And we've been engaged in a wide range of primarily stepping up technology implementation projects focused on building implementation models around this notion of comprehensive literacy. And one of the big things that I'll be emphasizing today is the need for us to be looking at emergent and conventional literacy when we're talking about the population of students who have extensive support needs. Next slide, please. I'm focusing specifically on print literacy. And while in general education or high incidence literacy, that may be a taken for granted, we have a history in literacy for students with extensive support needs of thinking so broadly about literacy that sometimes anything that is communication gets counted as literacy. And the result of that for many students with extensive support needs has been really limited opportunity to learn. So we've been focusing fairly narrowly on print literacy in order to maximize learning opportunity, not because we don't value all of the other forms of literacy that are out there, but because we want to make sure that all students have access to instruction that supports their long-term ability to make gains in areas of reading and writing, traditional orthography. And by that, we mean letters and words in print or braille, not pictures, not alternatives to print that we often think about when we're trying to make curriculum accessible to this group of students. Next slide, please. We've been at the Center for Literacy and Disability Studies writing and talking about this concept of comprehensive literacy instruction for a number of years. As we use that term, we've historically talked about instruction that addresses each of the elements that's necessary for a student to learn to read with comprehension and write to convey thinking with others. We are, for a long time, been trying to help people think about instruction that does this sort of teaching all of the elements on a daily and a weekly basis. And again, historically, we've made the case that some students have had access to all of the elements, but it might have taken them 5 or 10 years to get there. So we've started with sight words, and then once students learn some sight words, we might begin to focus on some phonics 6 months or 6 years later. And once students are actually reading some words, then we might focus on comprehension. And what we're doing in our view of comprehensive literacy instruction is help people think about how do you systematically and explicitly address all of the things that are required across a day and a week and a school year, as opposed to stringing them out over a number of months or years. Next slide, please. When ESSA was ratified, if that's the right word, when ESSA became our law, we were pretty delighted to see the notion of comprehensive literacy show up because it's very consistent with the way that we've used that term. In ESSA, comprehensive literacy is a multifaceted definition. It talks about the need for developmentally appropriate, contextually explicit, and systematic instruction, combined with frequent practice. And that combination is very consistent with the way that we've historically written and tried to help others understand comprehensive literacy. It also is age-appropriate, explicit, systematic, and intentional across multiple areas. So phonological awareness, phonics, coding, spelling, vocabulary, language, fluency, reading comprehension. It addresses writing in a systematic way over time. It makes available students opportunities to be reading text, so high quality text that is appropriate. We talk about text being age and ability respectful, trying to make sure that particularly for our adolescents who are still beginning level readers, that we're putting materials into their hands that they can read so that they can get better at reading, but we're making sure that those materials are respectful of who they are as adolescents who've had many years of experience with the world around them. Next slide, please. ESSA also talks about this notion for frequent practice. And if we're going to be thinking about practice, we have to be thinking about motivation. So how are we getting students interested and motivated in the acts of reading and writing so that they're interested in practicing often enough that they can get better at the two? It incorporates principles of universal design. It depends on teachers to work together in collaboration to plan, instruct, and assess students, and links directly to state academic standards. That last piece is really important because, in fact, comprehensive literacy is bigger than grade level content standards. And comprehensive literacy addresses more than what you would typically find in any one grade level set of standards. And so oftentimes we're trying to go above and beyond just providing access to standards in thinking about making sure that we're addressing the full range of student skills and abilities. Next slide, please. This notion of comprehensive literacy for us applies across the full continuum from emergent to conventional literacy. ESSA, rightly so, emphasizes conventional literacy because by early and first grade, the vast majority of students in public schools in the United States are literate. They are conventionally literate. But among students with significant extensive support needs, an enormous percentage among students with significant cognitive disabilities who participate in alternate assessments based on alternate achievement standards, 80% are still emergent in their understandings of literacy. So they may have a few conventional literacy skills, and the research suggests that many can identify a handful of sight words, but they're missing many of the really critical emergent literacy skills and understandings that are going to allow them to build conventional literacy skills that they can apply and use meaningfully when they're reading and when they're writing to communicate with others. Next slide, please. So when I talk about emergent literacy, I'm talking about all of the reading and writing that individuals do before they can read and write conventionally. So they're very non-conventional and context dependent. So when students are emergent, if they can write at all, they write in ways that adults who are with them in the same time and place as they're producing that text, that we might be able to understand what they've done. But if they turned it over to somebody who wasn't there, it is unconventional. They wouldn't be able to understand it. Just yesterday in one of the schools I was in, a middle school student with extensive support needs was writing, and he was writing about something special that had happened over the weekend, and he was writing French toast. And I watched him write it, and his penmanship is not so good. Most people wouldn't recognize the letters that he wrote once they went down on the paper, but if you watched him produce the text, you realized that stacked one on top of the other, he had written a letter shape for each of the letters in the word toast, as long as you spell toast, T-O-S-T. And so it's an example of the kind of non-conventional ways that students who are emerging in their understandings begin using text. Other people couldn't read it, but watching him do that, it was pretty clear what he was trying to communicate to other people. These understandings over time, we can watch them, and we see children and older students develop their understandings of both the forms and the conventions of print. Emergent literacy is really important for us to understand, to get people away from thinking that there are students who are and are not able to read and write. That in fact, if you're alive, you're on the emergent literacy continuum, and our job is to provide information and experience and opportunity that allows students to make progress toward more conventional reading and writing skills each and every day. Next slide, please. We contrast that with conventional literacy, and that's the ability to communicate meaning either receptively by reading or expressively by writing. Conventional literacy is understood independent of context. So that's a student who can pick up a book that's unfamiliar to them, be able to read those words and understand them without having somebody else read the book and explain it to them first. It's a student who can spell well enough that people who don't know them will be able to read and understand the text that they've generated outside of the context. As you move to conventional literacy, it doesn't mean that you're producing error-free or that you're reading in an error-free way, but you're close enough that you can get to the level of meaning that was intended, either understanding it or conveying it to other people. Next slide, please. So ESSA, back at the definition, requires that we use age-appropriate, valid, and reliable screening assessments, diagnostic assessments, formative assessment processes, and summative assessments to identify a child's learning need, to inform instruction, and to monitor the child's progress and the effects of instruction. And fully support that statement. But unfortunately, we don't have many of those tools that are accessible to students with extensive support needs, particularly students with extensive support needs who do not yet have symbolic communication, so the ability to use language to expressively communicate with other people, whether that's through speech or sign or some form of augmentative and alternative communication. We also have very few tools that are age appropriate, valid, and reliable for students who are older, emergent readers and writers. And so we have been trying to help, we're part of many people trying to help develop these tools. But in the meanwhile, we need teachers to get going. We can't keep waiting and keep providing instruction that is sort of focused on the skills that we can figure out how to teach, or the skills that we are able to pick and choose from the grade level curriculum and make accessible, but instead really be thinking about, should we be focused on comprehensive emergent literacy instruction or comprehensive conventional literacy instruction? The vast majority, better than 90% of students with extensive support needs read with comprehension at a beginning second grade level or below. They are by definition, as a population of students, regardless of their age, beginning readers and writers from a beginning early conventional level down to early emergent. By definition, they all need everything every day. And so we have to figure out what is the right everything that we should be focused on for one particular child. So next slide, please. So we have been working around 4 critical questions that, when we've gotten teachers and teams to think about these 4 questions and focus their instruction according to this simple decision making process, we have students who are making really great progress. So this very efficient way of assessing students in order to get going with comprehensive instruction has 4 questions. We ask, does the learner know most of the letters most of the time? We know from decades of research around alphabet knowledge that students don't know all of the letters and the letter names and the letter sounds all of the time until they actually start doing some reading and writing. They'll make errors that are simple reversals, for example, where they'll misidentify a lowercase b for a d, for example, until they get to the place that they're really conventionally using those letters in reading and writing on a regular basis. So our rule is, do they know most of them most of the time? And it's okay if it's a combination of letter names and letter sounds. What we're trying to make sure is that if we're going to move into conventional reading and writing instruction, students have enough knowledge of the alphabet that they at least understand that those are letters and not numbers and or some other kind of symbol or shape, but that they're letters that we use to write words, and words are used to create text. We're asking, does the learner engage actively during shared reading? Ultimately, being able to read with comprehension is an active process. And so we have to have students at a place where they're willing to actively engage with text if we're going to help them get beyond really surface level memory kind of comprehension tasks. So does the learner know most of the letters most of the time? Do they actively engage during shared reading? Do they have a means of communication and interaction? And by that, we mean a symbolic means of communication and interaction. Can they use speech or sign language or some form of augmentative and alternative communication to communicate with us as we're engaged in a variety of literacy tasks? Next slide, please. Can you go back? I'm sorry. As we look at those 4 questions, if we have all 4 yeses, so if the answer for the individual student is yes to each of those 4 questions, that's a student who we focus on providing comprehensive conventional literacy instruction. But if we have 1 or more no's, any one no, we're sticking with comprehensive emergent literacy instruction. and making sure every day they're getting all of the elements of instruction we know students need in order to develop those key emergent literacy skills and understandings so they can be successful, not just in mastering conventional literacy skills, but in being able to use those skills effectively to read and write, to communicate and gain meaning from others. Next slide, please. So emergent literacy understandings, what do we mean by that? Well, emergent literacy understandings are probably best described from our view by Seneschal and colleagues. They talk about the need to develop conceptual knowledge about the functions of print, to view yourself as a learner, to develop procedural knowledge related to letters and sounds and words, to develop oral language understanding and use, that's that symbolic communication, and to develop really critical metalinguistic skills in phonological and syntactic awareness. These emergent literacy understandings develop as a result of opportunity and experience. It's not age related, it's not development related, it's opportunity and experience related. So we work every day. Today, I was in a classroom with 18 and 21-year-olds who are emergent in their literacy understandings because of a lack of opportunity and experience through the years to be able to engage meaningfully with print in both adult-directed and student-directed ways. Next slide, please. In contrast, conventional literacy develops as a result of a combination of teacher-directed instruction and frequent opportunities to engage meaningfully and successfully in reading, writing, and interactions with others around text. Conventional literacy skills and understandings are defined in ESSA to include phonological awareness, phonics, decoding, spelling, oral language skills, reading book fluency, reading comprehension, writing, and probably a number of other skills that we can add to that list. Next slide, please. We're helping teachers think about creating the necessary conditions for their comprehensive literacy instruction to be successful. So we're doing things like helping special ed teachers who are trained to work with students with the most significant disabilities to partner with more knowledgeable others, with general education teachers and reading specialists and speech language pathologists who have deeper knowledge and understanding around literacy and language development. We're creating interactive and participatory lesson structures. We're creating a lot of opportunities for repetition, but it's repetition with variety. We're helping people think about students having to be cognitively engaged and building cognitive clarity. So students understand why they're learning what they're learning, and it's not about they're working in order to earn something else, but how do we make the learning we're doing interesting enough to them, and how do we help them understand why it matters? They should have a personal connection. We need to be creating classrooms where children and adults are willing to take risks. And you'll see number 8 of all of these conditions is that our instruction is comprehensive. We're not just teaching one skill at a time, we're trying to do all of these things. Well, that requires significant time allocation, as much as 2.5 hours a day. And it requires that we have high expectations of teachers and of the students who are in their classrooms with them. Next slide, please. We take a routines-based approach to do this to help teachers who oftentimes do not have a strong background in reading and literacy, and many teachers who, if they did take coursework in literacy, learned very little about emergent literacy. And so by taking a routines-based approach, we're able to accomplish those conditions of learning. We're able to help teachers and children be able to have some expectation of what they're supposed to be doing, but we're able to change up the content frequently enough that they're getting that repetition with variety that they need. Next slide, please. In order to learn more about both of these, I would point you to 4 different OSEP-funded projects. If you want to learn more about emergent literacy, you could go to project-core or sharedreader.org. And to learn more about comprehensive literacy routines for students with extensive support needs, you could go to dlmpd.com or buildingbridges-ela.com. Next slide, please. And just some references for you, and I will turn it over from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Appreciate it. Great information. So we had a question in the chat about PowerPoint slides, and we do not have individual PowerPoint slides to be able to share. However, there is a sheet up there on the website with resources that you can access in addition to what the sites that Karen just shared. And that also this session is being recorded. It will be up, it will be shared out. I'm not sure exactly what date, but after the conference with and up on the OSEP website. So that is another possibility to come back on. So let me now pass it over to Shawnee. And Shawnee, we'll let you take that away.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Shawnee Wakeman from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. We've spent decades working to create access to and increase progress in literacy outcomes for students with significant cognitive disabilities, specifically those with intellectual disability, multiple disability, or autism. The examples that you're going to see in my presentation come primarily from two current projects, Project Impact, which is a model demonstration project that targets literacy instruction for students with intellectual disability, and the TIES Center, which Gail mentioned earlier, which is a technical assistance center. If you'd like to go to the next slide. So this image comes from a conceptual model from Diane Browder and others in 2009, which is the foundation for the comprehensive approach to teaching literacy. Dr. Jenny Root and others are currently working on an evolution of this piece, which includes Scarborough's reading rope that targets the relationship between language comprehension, which is applying strategies to vocabulary and language structures, and word recognition, which is automaticity with decoding and sight words. This new evolution of the Browder model provides a broader view of comprehensive literacy. It's expected that literacy skills are embedded within lessons in any and every content area. You're going to hear me kind of repeat a lot of what Dr. Erickson was saying earlier, with some different context, but you're going to hear some of the same kind of ideas. I've included the websites here for two of the sources, the Project Impact and the TIES Center, that you'll see as we break down the components that are necessary in the model of comprehensive literacy. If you want to go to the next slide. I believe in an effective literacy model for students with this population has opportunities to learn to decode text, as Dr. Erickson talked about, opportunities to comprehend text, both listening and reading as appropriate, and in writing in a variety of contexts with speaking and listening skills embedded across all three areas. These lessons must be filled with evidence-based practices, which we'll just talk about in a few minutes, and create increased accessibility by applying the principles of universal design. But what's a little bit different here is that you're getting a feedback loop that includes what students are and what works for students and what does not work for students. On the next slide, you'll see that we have 5 components that we believe are a comprehensive literacy model for students in this population. These 5 provide the foundation for building skills over time using the principle of parsimony. Students with significant cognitive disabilities typically require more time to acquire skills, to build that fluency, to generalize those skills across content areas and context. We have no time to waste. By designing instruction that attends to these components, educators give students the best chance to develop decoding, comprehension, and writing skills. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see the first piece that I'm going to propose is providing lessons that target the 3 areas mentioned previously. Historically, this population has participated in the most research related to comprehension and vocabulary, with more research in the area of decoding, as Dr. Erickson talked about, and less so in the area of writing. Expectations for instruction in all 3 areas are necessary for this population to demonstrate they can meet our expectations when they're provided with the right supports and high-quality instruction. You'll see examples of students engaging in all 3 areas throughout the presentation. This image on the screen is of a student with significant cognitive disabilities and her peer partner in the gen ed classroom using picture-supported text and an adaptive graphic organizer to produce a written product. This product is of an informational text about sequencing the events. If you go to the next slide, I just want to point out to you that you'll see some yellow sticky notes that show up on some of the slides, and that's just a piece for you to reflect on your own projects. The red text that you'll see is where we're trying to push the envelope a little bit for the future. So the second component that I'm going to describe supports a comprehensive literacy model is designing instruction using the grade level standards as the starting point. The content within the grade level standards should be used for making decisions about the priorities in instruction. The content of instruction should clearly reflect the least dangerous assumption and should be no different than necessary. We shouldn't, for example, avoid teaching poetry or rhyming words or not allowing students to use supports to create a product that communicates their thoughts and ideas. While the complexity of the text increases across the grade bands, the concepts within literacy instruction can repeat across grade levels. By working with gen ed partners and curriculum specialists within the schools and the districts, educators in special education can identify these priorities to begin with instruction and then address the standards for all the literacy areas. Research has shown that most students in the population are educated in a self-contained classroom. Time for common planning between the special and the general educators is one of the largest barriers that we have found to creating standards-based lessons. By sharing lessons and providing training using common tools, special educators may be able to adapt literacy lessons developed by PLCs or district curriculum teams to provide instruction addressing a wider range of standards. On the next slide, you're going to see an example from Project Impact in which the general education partner outlined the learning targets, the strategies they plan to use, the vocabulary, and the questions when working on a lesson to promote comprehension in the general education classroom. Our special education teachers had the original text as well as an adapted version of the text. This unit overview tool helped the educators tighten their instructional focus while providing a range of challenge levels and learning targets that were appropriate for the students in their classroom. On the next slide, you'll see with those learning targets and the priorities, the special educators were then able to develop lessons that included grade level concepts and vocabulary that used evidence-based practices identified for students in the population. Students in the self-contained classrooms were often not engaging in content for a range of literacy concepts. For this lesson, the example is it's about character traits, and many of our students had not had instruction about character traits before. Lessons using the grade level resource, be it a unit overview or a district curriculum resource or a PLC lesson plan, can be designed and implemented by special educators. One pro that we've found of published curricula is that they can include literary concepts that educators wouldn't plan for on their own. But conversely, a con for educators only using published curriculum is that the instruction in the classroom then only addresses those concepts within the curriculum, which likely does not reflect the breadth of the concepts in the grade level standard. On the next slide, we tried to push the envelope and we supported teachers to co-plan lessons that were co-taught in the general education setting. We found that educators broadened their scope of instruction, that they increased their learning expectations and opportunities for students with significant cognitive disabilities, and that the students were able to meet those expectations. We often heard from our educators how surprised they were for what the students were able to learn. The third component on the next slide relates to creating active response opportunities with text. The opportunities to respond and engage with text is critical, regardless of the learning target, whether it's decoding, comprehension, or writing. Imagine learning to try and decode without having opportunities to make or blend sounds. The number of opportunities to make individual or group responses directly correlates to learning. Students who do not get sufficient opportunities to engage in text will not develop literacy skills. Additionally, students should engage academically with their peers, with and without disabilities. Students should have opportunities to write messages, as well as to talk and listen to each other. A literacy block must embed speaking and listening and writing standards with an audience of peers. On the next slide, you'll see that while not originally part of our project goals, we found anecdotally within Project Impact that students in both the general education and the special education were passively engaged on average more than half the time during the lesson. Additionally, the special education students directed 100% of their responses to the adults in the classroom and had no skills to engage in cooperative learning strategies. Through coaching and reflection, every educator we worked with increased the number of opportunities for all students to actively engage both independently and collaboratively during their literacy block. The next slide will talk about the increase of opportunities didn't happen without planning. For engagement, our students needed opportunities to practice some of the engagement strategies with a familiar content. For example, for turn and talk or think, pair, share was one of the strategies that none of the students were familiar with. Teachers practice with the special education literacy lessons to build students' familiarity with the strategy. Additionally, we recommended that teachers plan for students to read and listen to text if the load of decoding impacts their comprehension efforts. Next, most of the students had never been taught to ask questions about the text. Encouraging students to explore the literary materials can increase student interest and excitement for reading and writing. Finally, some of the students do not always need response options to support their answers and can be challenged to share their own ideas. Other students do need those options, which can provide the student more confidence to share their responses. Regardless, to increase the opportunities to respond, educators must know how to best support students to communicate that response. On the next slide, you'll see a sequence of engagement opportunities for the same student. On the left, he engages in a small group reading an adapted text with vocabulary cards. He progresses to reading questions on the computer. Next, he uses supports, a picture and text glossary, and an adapted graphic organizer along with the original text to answer questions in the general education classroom with his non-disabled peers. On the next slide, I hope it works, we have a short video clip showcasing one student in particular, as he uses response supports that he generated in the special ed classroom using the general education text to identify his favorite adventure in the text. It was Peter Pan. In the general education classroom, you'll see he has a peer support. And I, again, cross my fingers, hope it works.
And you go back into the text and find where an adventure happened in the text. So if you've got one in your head, go find it. Where did it happen? You got one in your head? Ooh, Reg got one already written down. I found it. Found it? I think Reg has one. Hey, I got one. You got one? Does anyone want to share their adventure? Do you want to share your adventure? Reg, do you want to share your adventure? There's Peter and Tyrant and Peter Pan stuff. I see one on yours.
It worked, yay. On this slide is another example of a sequence of opportunities to respond with appropriate supports in the middle school classroom. The students were working on similes. In the special ed classroom, the students used an adapted text with visual supports and a graphic organizer. They then applied that knowledge in the general education classroom during a turn and talk with a peer using the grade level text. On the next slide, we describe one way to help reinforce the literary concept that you'll see on the left, which again is about character traits, or the main idea for the chapter as you see on the right. Infuse vocabulary and promote student decoding is the use of a repeated storyline within an adapted text. The use of the storyline increases the opportunities for students to engage and make responses during the reading of the text. On the next slide, we'll describe the fourth component, which is the use of evidence-based practices within instruction. There are numerous evidence-based practices for instruction based upon the research within the special and the general education classrooms. The silos of practice are still prevalent, however, as few educator preparation programs include the EPBs of the general education or the EPBs of the special education in the same program. There are numerous practices used within the general education that you'll see in red on the slide that this population could also benefit from, while explicit and systematic instruction EPBs for the population that's on the left are also utilized. On the next slide, the most familiar to special education teachers are the use of systematic instruction strategies, constant time delay, and the system of least prompts, which are both evidence-based practices. Constant time delay is often used to teach decoding and vocabulary with definitions. The system of least prompts can be used to teach comprehension and writing, often in the structure of a task analysis. The next slide will show you that the TIE Center has developed numerous resources to support instruction using common general education strategies such as think alouds, strategies to make inferences, and facilitating whole group discussion. These strategies, while not EPBs as of yet, are areas to address in additional research and utilized by educators in practice to provide opportunity and challenge within literacy lessons. The next slide will show you that graphic organizers are a promising practice in inclusive settings for students with significant cognitive disabilities and an evidence-based practice as supports in the special education setting. Their use within literacy instruction should be common practice. On the next slide, as I've previously said, collaborative strategies such as a turn and talk have an evidence base for the general education classroom, and we want our students to be active participants in such a strategy. We taught students with and without disabilities in impact to follow this task analysis of the process. This was designed to support students with disabilities to share their ideas and listen to the ideas of their partners, two of which that they weren't familiar with. It was also designed to support the peers to encourage and listen to the ideas of the students with disabilities, as they were typically used to telling the students with this disability what their idea was and moving on. Finally, the last component of the comprehensive literacy model must be creating accessibility for all students. By planning for and creating accessible learning targets, text, and materials, barriers within instruction for students with and without disabilities can be removed. On the next slide, you'll see for comprehension that we promoted adapted text with picture symbols. Some students needed that support for understanding and others do not. For decoding, we can use an adapted text that can be used, but picture supports are not included in that text. We also provided on the next slide an adapted synopsis for students, particularly when the learning target was something like making comparisons across chapters to help reduce the cognitive load. Finally, on the next slide, we also used adapted text with picture symbols within the questions to support and develop concept understanding within informational text, such as the one you see here that was in science. There are 5 additional considerations that I'd like to leave you with as we think about a comprehensive literacy model. The first of those, that there should be a shared space for reading, both decoding and comprehension, as well as writing. Speaking and listening can be embedded across the content areas. And I saw on Dr. Erickson's previous slide that she was saying that 2.5 hours should be dedicated to this. And we're saying that as well, is that we should have a literacy block that should be embedded opportunities for students to reinforce their understanding and generalize their skills. Next, we can't assume that students have had the opportunities to learn content in previous grades or grade bands. Educators in the past have not all taught decoding and emergent literacy to this population. Even though they are not grade level standards in middle and high school for decoding and fluency, students should always be given the opportunity to learn to read. One is never too old to learn that critical life skill. Next, I encourage us to raise the bar, include higher order thinking questions. Literal recall is but one comprehension skill. Give the students the skills and strategies to learn to use context clues and making inferences, for example, within a text. Not all students need all supports. Adapt only as much as appropriate for the students and fade it when it's no longer needed. We had a young lady in our study in middle school who didn't need the response options, but she'd always been presented those options. When we took them away, she wasn't happy at first until she realized she could really share her ideas and thinking about the text. She told us very clearly about the characters that she did not like and why she did not like them when we were reading The Outsiders, and it opened up her voice related to text. Finally, change for educators isn't easy. Providing educators with supports to utilize even one new strategy a semester can be done if they consider the impactful 5 of designing instruction with access, opportunity, communication supports, response prompting, and feedback for students. A comprehensive literacy model is just that, comprehensive. Students with significant cognitive disabilities deserve opportunities to learn reading and writing and speaking and listening content standards. There is research to prove that the population is able to reach those high expectations when high quality instruction is provided. And now I'm going to turn it over actually to Ashley, who's going to talk about her approach in South Carolina.
Thanks, Dr. Wakeman. As Dr. Wakeman just said, my name is Ashley Davies. Although I'm currently the State 619 Part B coordinator in South Carolina, I spent almost 2 decades as a classroom teacher for children with the most significant disabilities prior to coming to the State Department of Education. During my time as a classroom teacher, reading instruction for my students definitely evolved. But before I began any instruction in my classroom, I took the role and responsibility of finding out who my students were and what needed to be done. Next slide, please. So as we dive into learning how this works in the classroom, the first step that I charge all teachers and school-based personnel with is getting to know the students who are in that classroom. Teachers are able to use current IEPs, evaluation reports, assessment results, and any other data that might be relevant to determine the current present levels of each student. Additionally, it's important to get to know interests of the student. This can be done informally and formally via the student, via the parents, and via previous teachers that the students may have had. Essentially, no instruction can begin until a baseline is established. This may mean that more assessments might be needed if there's unknown information. In determining present levels, teachers must also determine the best mode of communication for a student. Just because a student cannot talk or verbally communicate does not mean the student does not understand and cannot read. Educators, it is our responsibility to truly determine the best response mode for each student and what needs to happen to make the learning possible and accessible for each student. Delivering instruction verbally is wonderful, but oftentimes that is not enough for our students to master content and to make meaningful progress. Teachers must plan for assistive technology, both in high and low tech forms, and make sure that any other accessibility needs are met before instruction can begin. Next slide, please. As Dr. Erickson noted, one way of determining a starting place is to use these 4 questions to determine if the student is able to begin comprehensive emergent literacy interventions or if the student is actually ready to begin with comprehensive conventional literacy interventions. As the teacher and school-based staff, it is the responsibility of these individuals to determine if a student knows letters most of the time, engages during shared reading, has a means of communication and interaction, and understands that writing involves letters and words. It's important to note that the way a student shows that they know letters most of the time may not always be verbally. We as teachers must make sure that we truly are getting a clear picture of what the student knows and what the student is able to communicate before we can make a determination. Furthermore, engagement for students with reading looks different. Our students have many different disabilities and many different skills and weaknesses, and so we must determine what engagement looks like for each student in our classroom. And engagement may look very, very different for each student. And finally, we have to make sure that we know how a student is communicating and interacting with you as the teacher and with the peers and other adults in the classroom. And if the student is not communicating and interacting with other adults or students in the classroom, we have to find a starting point to give the student that communication tool. Every student absolutely deserves a way to communicate. And so it is our job as educators to build that foundation if there's not one already present. And finally, writing does not always involve pencil and paper. There are adaptive and other high-tech ways that can depict writing and show that a student truly understands what written expression is in its approach to reading. We have to make sure that we give students the opportunity to show what they are capable of in writing, far from just using pencil and paper. Next slide, please. And so as we go about our day gathering baseline data to begin instruction in our classroom for students with the most significant disabilities, teachers must also continue to plan for barriers in the environment. The barriers in the environment might be physical, they might be social, and they might be academic. All of these must be planned for in order for instruction to be meaningful. To successfully prepare, co-planning among general education and special education teachers, as well as related service personnel, is key. The teachers together must consider the physical makeup of the classroom, how the instruction will be delivered, what standards will be addressed, and how each student will be monitored for understanding and progress. Currently, over 90% of students with the most significant disabilities are educated in a self-contained classroom without access to their non-disabled peers during reading instruction. Research shows that impacts are far greater and students make more significant progress when they are instructed in an inclusive environment. Furthermore, it's important to note that the students are not the barriers. We must overcome the needs of the students so that we give the students access to meaningful instruction in an inclusive setting. Next slide, please. And so in 2015, OSEP published a letter giving guidance to LEAs regarding the instruction for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. Amongst other things, one thing was made clear, and that was that these students are entitled to instruction on the general education standards too. Although addressed in their IEP often as modified standards, that does not mean the standards will not be taught. Common Core standards in grades K through 5 often address reading foundations, but not the entire comprehensive literacy model. It is so important that in order for our students to excel on these standards and make progress, the entire comprehensive literacy model must be considered. Instruction must be delivered, and it's important to remember that as students move further along in school, oftentimes reading foundations are not addressed in grades 6 and above. We must continue to provide this instruction similar to an MTSS approach of a Tier 3 intervention, which would address the deficits in earlier grade standards and skills. A Tier 3 intervention does not take the place of a general education standard, but it is taught in addition to the general education standard. Oftentimes, state education agencies and local education agencies make recommendations for curriculums that are to be utilized in classrooms. They are wonderful tools and assets to help teachers deliver meaningful instruction, but they do not replace the requirement to teach the standards. Next slide, please. As reading has evolved from a functional to an academic approach, it's important to keep in mind that functional and academic skills are intertwined throughout a student's day. What we know is that for any student to be successful, reading is a key in every aspect of their life. As teachers of students with the most significant disabilities, reading doesn't happen at one time throughout a school day. Reading happens all day. As Dr. Wakeman and Dr. Erickson noted, reading instruction should encompass 2.5 hours a day or more. This does not mean that reading instruction has to occur in one 2.5 hour block or consecutively, but we have to plan for meaningful reading instruction in its entirety throughout the day. Planning for instruction of reading on what we know as functional or life skills is still a key as we provide students with the most knowledge to be as independent and successful post-school as possible. Teachers must remain focused on the entitlement of all students to receive instruction on the general education standards. Collaboration again amongst educators can make this as seamless as possible. Furthermore, teachers are required to instruct and report progress on IEP goals of students. These goals, though, are not the end-all be-all of instruction. A simple misconception is that if it's not written on the IEP, then it does not need to be taught, and that is just false. A student is entitled to general education instruction in all aspects of reading, even if each individual aspect does not have an IEP goal. Next slide, please. And so, how do we get going? From a former teacher perspective, creativity is a key. It is a heavy lift to begin the planning process for students with the most significant disabilities and their instruction on the general education standards, but it's required. What needs to be considered are creative ways to make this happen. Additionally, instruction should be systematically and intentionally planned. Planning time should be set aside between special education and general education services, as well as related service providers. There should be no incidental learning that is taking the place of intentional instruction in all of the comprehensive literacy areas for reading. Additionally, teachers should utilize grouping abilities and the use of support staff. We have to make meaningful use of all individuals so that students receive the best instruction possible in the standards in which they're entitled to that instruction. Next slide, please. And as we deliver that instruction, we also have to make sure that we're effectively measuring our outcomes. Once instruction begins, it's important to remember that instruction is not meaningful unless outcomes are measured. IEP goals must be reported on, and minimal progress is no longer good enough. It's important to remember that the students must also be reported with their progress on the state standards. A teacher must consider all factors when measuring progress, including student response mode, wait time, levels of prompting, the number of learning opportunities, and how mastery will be defined. This can vary from student to student, and oftentimes reading progressions are not linear for our students with the most significant disabilities. Furthermore, instruction should be analyzed so that minimal or no progress is turned into adequate progress as it applies to each student. This may mean varying instruction delivery models, varying response mode, but making sure that the student is able to access and receive instruction in the most meaningful way possible. It's imperative to remember that adequate progress looks different for each student with significant disabilities, and one student should never be compared to a peer in the same class. Next slide, please. Finally, although I know that challenges do exist, students with significant cognitive disabilities do not need to spend their entire day in a self-contained classroom. They can learn with their peers. Starting small is a step towards more and more inclusive opportunities for children with the most significant cognitive disabilities. After all, oftentimes their best teacher is a peer sitting next to them. Research by Dr. Wakeman and colleagues shows that scores of post-test for students who were participants in inclusive settings for lessons were statistically more significantly positive, and they showed better outcomes than students who were instructed in a self-contained environment. So as we conclude, I charge you to empower your teachers, provide them with the tools needed to provide instruction for our students with the most significant cognitive disabilities in inclusive settings so that students are able to learn along their non-disabled peers on the same general education standards. Next slide, please. Those are some references, and we really appreciate your time today. I know that we are going to have some time for some questions.
Thank you, Ashley. So let me just take a couple moments and think about, before we going to open up to question, Q&A, think about just some of the big picture pieces that we just talked about. So David, can you pull up the slides we just had? The slides you had up there? Yep, great, perfect. Okay, so the next slide, please. So I think one of the things that you're hearing in this, in both, whether you're talking about comprehensive emergent or comprehensive conventional literacy, is that the evidence-based piece that just came out so strongly. And lots of times, what we'll see in the next slide is that a lot of our kids are not receiving the full scope of the work. And so when we think about it, actually, 20 years ago, we had the National Reading Panel, and the National Reading Panel really, did through a lot of looking at the research and everything, came up with some of the core pieces. They came up with the core pieces that all students need to learn to read. However, we made assumptions, all of us in the field may have made assumptions that this didn't apply really to all kids. And what we know now through the research and through what we're shared today is that the effective evidence-based, comprehensive, robust literacy instruction matters for all kids. So thinking about that in that way is really important. And the presenters today showed that, how that comes out in with kids along the continuum and in different environments. So one of our charges is to really eliminate this research to practice gap for teaching comprehensive literacy and inclusive education. Both are showing to have very extremely positive benefits for students with extensive support needs. And so how do we do that? One of them is just thinking about, all of us getting, ensuring that we have the comprehensive literacy for kids. And that gets really challenging our beliefs. Do we believe that students can learn to read? Do we believe that all students can we presume competence and that all students with the right instruction will make gains and become readers to whatever extent they are, raise that bar high, and doing it in that way. And so that's something and that least dangerous assumption that Dr. Wakeman mentioned, where we think about, in the absence of any other evidence, let's err on the side of giving kids access so that we challenge them to be learners and support them in accessing that learning. Another one is to really, for all of us to have that deep understanding of how to teach kids along the whole continuum so that we are able to meet kids' needs, and not just assume that if they are emergent readers, that they just get a slice of a robust comprehensive program. For instance, they only get sight words, and that is a common thing that's still out there. It's a common belief. So let's challenge ourselves that way. And then all three presenters talked about the importance of collaborating with educational teams. This is one where it's like, go with not alone. This is where using the expertise of the speech therapist, the general education teacher, the special education teachers, all of them together to come and identify where are kids at, how can we remove barriers to their learning, and how can we have them show what they know. This is where the collective wisdom of everyone is so important. And then finally, a last piece just to think about on the next slide, please. We talked about, the 2.5 hour block. Ashley mentioned about, really thinking about how do you embed this across the day. So actually all the speakers did. So really thinking about that and really getting, understanding more about looking for those natural opportunities that where you can do instruction, reading instruction throughout the day, and how do they fit in with the general education activities and routines. They're there. We just we need to recognize them and maximize their use. And then finally, sometimes it gets confusing as to how to meet the needs of students who still are, they need to access general education curriculum. At the same time, they have skills to learn, some pretty more basic skills to learn or to fill in gaps. And the MTSS, the multi-tiered systems of support, is one way of really thinking through that. If in its essence, the MTSS is an inclusive system, where you're getting the more intensive instruction. Those students are getting it in addition to whether their core instruction in their gen ed classroom, and whether there's any tier 2 work, say around pre-teaching and reteaching. And we saw that in some of the examples where pre-teaching the work allowed a student to then access their the learning in the gen ed classroom. And when we think about that and collaborate and pull that together, that's where the complexity comes in at first. But I think once there's a flow to that and there's routines involved with doing that, it becomes a much more natural system for educating students. But you're still doing all the components of meeting students' needs, access to standards, meeting their individual literacy needs. So there's a couple resources there from the TIES Center that might, if you want to dig deeper into embedded instruction and MTSS, if you go onto the tiescenter.org, you can see a variety of ones that will support literacy in the classroom and in addition to these two concepts. So with that, I'd like to go back and just open it up to the audience, so we could bring all of us up. And we do have one question from before that's for Shawnee. So Shawnee, can you please share if assistive technology is being considered for the comprehensive literacy model? There's a surprise that this was not clearly explained, and kind of thinking how you embed that, especially after remote learning, where we ended up doing so much with technology.
Sure. So assistive technology in our model would fall in that accessibility piece. So if you think about using assistive technology in the way that it's designed for a student who is nonverbal, and we would be teaching them to decode. Instead of, we would show them the word, cat, and have them, break out the sounds, that we would be providing the sounds for them, and they would be using their assistive technology to replicate those sounds. So we would go k, and they would find in their device the k to make the k sound, and then at to be able to blend that together for cat. So the students who are nonverbal would be using assistive technology to learn to decode. Additionally, for students who can't write or are unable to make, as Karen described as well, and you saw in some of the samples, the motor control for writing, they may not have that kind of ability, but doesn't mean they can't write. They can use speech to text, or they can use text to speech as well to be able to read and to watch, to listen to some of the text be read aloud. So assistive technology certainly plays a role in our model in the accessibility piece.
Thank you. We have another comment here just thanking us for really connecting to the inclusive environment, for students with significant cognitive disabilities. And we all brought up that, this is not the norm at the moment. This is a direction that the country needs to move as a whole. And the research is pretty clear. We have a significant research to practice gap here. So talking about that and embedding it in the examples was terrific. But let me open it up. If there's any other questions, please just keep dropping them in the chat. But also maybe I'll just open it up to the presenters really quick. Was there anything you had wished you had wanted to say, but you didn't get to because you were trying to meet your time limits?
I think the one thing that I would want to add, we've all been talking about students with significant support needs. And there's a large portion of students who participate in the alternate assessment based on alternate achievement standards who do not have symbolic communication. And even when we can provide it to them, they're not able to use it right away without some instruction. And so I mentioned very briefly our Project Core, but Project Core so the website is project-core.com. And then the sister project called Tar Heel Shared Reader, which is at sharedreader.org. Both of those projects are inclusive of students who have the most complex multiple disabilities who do not yet have conventional expressive means of communication. And both of them are designed to help teachers and teams provide comprehensive emergent literacy instruction that also is building early symbolic communication. And I think that as we have these conversations and as we talk about assistive technology and we talk about the ways that we're supporting kids, I just don't want that group of students to be left out. And in fact, we've been partnering recently with the National Center on Deafblindness to make sure that all really means all, and that we are making sure that we're building models that are inclusive of the full population of students with significant support needs. And so I just would like to make it really clear that as we're talking about comprehensive literacy, there are no students who historically people have said, yeah, but that no, we're talking about them also.
Wonderful point. Thank you. Anybody else? Ashley or Shawnee, would you like to add anything?
Gail, I think echoing off of what Karen just shared is that what we know is that children oftentimes will progress through their grades at a faster rate than their reading skills develop. And so it's so important as we provide inclusive opportunities for our students with the most significant disabilities that we are very mindful of what we're providing them with and the access that we provide, and that the content of what we are providing is appropriate for their age, and that we are not providing images or we're not providing things that would be more appropriate for a 3 and 4-year-old when the student has progressed to 6th grade. So I know that that's another element of planning, and another element that it adds to preparing for a lesson to be appropriate. But I think it's so important to note that the students and the materials that they're provided with should be age appropriate, and they should be inclusive of the setting that they're in, so that they're not singled out for different materials.
Thank you. We have another question here. I appreciate the focus on having high expectations for students with the most significant support needs. How can we emphasize this importance from the state to the LEA level so that teachers and principals understand the why for what you described? So I don't know, Ashley, if you would like to take that, being in the state person now and thinking about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the why is because they're entitled to the access, and because we have research that shows that there's more meaningful outcomes for the students when they're included in inclusive opportunities. So I think that that research is your why. I do think that there is an element to planning at the state agency that can be provided and disseminated to the LEAs as far as examples. I know being at the state agency, I often get questions of, well, can you give me an example, or can you show me how that works? And I think that that is super meaningful for our local education agencies to see how it works. And so, again, I think the research is your why, because the outcomes are greater when they're in an inclusive environment. And I think that the more we can do at the state agencies to provide examples and provide some frameworks for our districts to make this happen, and maybe even sitting down with them to plan, can help provide better outcomes for our students with the most significant disabilities.
I will
Thank
also say that for the folks that we have worked with, many of the teachers that we have worked with are excellent teachers, and they know what they know, and they trying to show that there are other things that can support students even more, that they can go even, because all teachers want the best for their students. They want their students to be successful. They just might not realize that what it is or how to get there. And providing some of that so it's relevant. When our teachers saw what our students could do, they were shocked. I can't believe that they were doing those kind of things. But they didn't think ahead of that. Even though the standards were there, even though lessons were there, even though they had access to some things, making all those connections sometimes was hard for them to be able to see how to put it all together. And being able to show a sample, as you said, Ashley, of something of how it's put together and what students can do, it's amazing, where they can go when that's made available to them.
Yeah, I think the work that we've all collectively done through model demonstration projects and through the stepping up projects that are all based on implementation science, that we've had to take into account how to communicate from administrators to teachers to classroom support staff. I think that's another group of people who interact so much with the students that we're talking about during this session. And we have to keep them in mind as we're thinking about what does that look like. So for example, in our implementation models around Project Core and Tar Heel Shared Reader and now Building Bridges, each of them takes an implementation science approach to helping administrators and school level teams do needs assessments and think about the fit and think about what they might need. And that is part of this emphasis on helping people understand the why. Your school and your students have a right to have access to the same kind of comprehensive instruction their peers get. So I think that each of our projects have specific supports that would speak to that question.
Yeah. And I'll also refer you to the TIE Center, where there's a number of resources there on the why. One of them called it's like 10 Reasons Why, and it just gives you videos and a lot of work that if you want to share that out and go forward, it's a great resource for doing that. Okay, we have, let's see, a question here. How does the science of reading play into your comprehensive literacy models? Also, do you take into account sensory needs for your accessibility models? So whoever wants to go first.
We've been thinking about and working in this world for a really long time. And the work that we do at the Center for Literacy and Disability Studies, it's interesting. We've gotten lots of calls and lots of people who have concerns that on the surface, the way we talk about particularly our word level instruction doesn't meet people's expectations of the science of reading. But in fact, the challenge that we've had from the beginning is that in the targeted work we do with the students who are sort of the bottom 50% of the 1%. So the students who really have the most complex multiple disabilities who participate in the alternate assessment. That is, we've been trying to work with that group. Nearly half of them do not have the ability to speak. They do not have the ability to articulate sounds well enough for us as teachers to be able to know how well they're responding to our explicit systematic instruction in phonics. So we have for a very long time written about and promoted and continue to develop approaches to teaching sequential systematic phonics that teach both phoneme by phoneme blending, teach vowel patterns, teach students about or how to decode without requiring students to have to say sounds, because they can't say the sounds. But yet inside their heads, they have to be able to produce sounds in order to do the blending and segmenting that's required to be able to decode and spell words. So our approach looks at Adam's processor model and tries to help teachers find ways to systematically and explicitly teach the phonological and orthographic processors. We can't take for granted among the population of students that we're working with that they have the word, that they know the words receptively, that they're learning to decode. With children without disabilities and children with high incidence disabilities, we can often make the assumption that they are very familiar with the words, particularly the beginning words, the consonant, vowel, consonant kinds of words that they're learning to decode. But many of the children that we're working with don't know the words. They don't know tier 1 vocabulary words. So we have to teach them those words in meaningful ways, meaning the top 2 processors in the processor model. So the point is that our conventional reading and writing instruction is very inclusive of the science of reading, but it applies the science of reading to a group of students who have not been included in the research that is the body of the science of reading. And so trying to think about how do we take what that research tells us and how do we make it truly accessible at a cognitive and linguistic level, not a performance level, but at a thinking inside the head level to this group of students. And then I would argue that the thing that we add to the science of reading is this attention to emergent literacy and making sure that we are taking an evidence-based scientific approach to really systematically building those early emergent literacy skills that are critical for students to ever move into conventional literacy, in order to ultimately be able to use spelling as the way that they can communicate whatever they want with whomever they want, whenever they want, because there is no other symbol set that's ever going to allow them to do that.
I would also say that with the, I don't know if you read the second part about the sensory needs for accessibility. Accessibility is a big piece for what we're talking about, what we're trying to do. Providing the technology to be able to kind of fill in some gaps, using tactile representations and sandpaper when we are going through some of the letter sounds, so that they can pair, feeling the textures of those letters and drawing those letters as the sounds are made, or they hear the sounds so they can make those connections. So I do think that we try and pair and we follow the science of literacy, the science of reading as much as we can with the accessibility, and we increase. It's almost like putting together a puzzle and trying to solve the pieces of what the students need and the extra pieces that they'll need for those levels of support so they can make those connections in their head.
So let me go quick, thank you. Let me go quick to just a practice question. And actually, maybe I'll draw you first into this one. Can you describe an example of what comprehensive literacy model might look like in the context of a setting with multi-tiered systems of support? That is, can you address what to do in the inclusive classroom and what might be addressed in the pull-out MTSS support setting?
Absolutely, Gail. So I think that that's a perfect opportunity that we remember that when students are in that general education classroom, they're accessing their grade level standards just like their non-disabled peers. And so there might be reading a novel, or they might be working on a science experiment. And so they're accessing what those students are accessing during the instruction, and their response options and their output might be modified based on the standards, but they are truly learning the same lesson as their non-disabled peers. But for instance, maybe a student is really continuing to struggle in the area of phonemic awareness. And so when the student is in that pull-out setting, that is the time for that tier 3 intervention in phonemic awareness. So we're not just saying, oh, never mind, you don't need to learn phonemic awareness. We know that that is not a 6th grade standard, but instead we're using the time and we're kind of labeling it as a tier 3 intervention that is provided when the student is in that pull-out setting, and so that they're still able to access the state standards and those grade level standards when they're in that inclusive setting.
Thank you. And I've also seen where, so for instance, if you're using a reader's workshop model in a classroom, then all students are part of the whole group instruction. In small groups, they might be getting some of their tier 2 work, like it might be a pre-teach or a reteach. And there also can be some individual work to really work on their individual skills. And then schools can also have, many schools also have a skills block worked in addition. That could be another time for some more intensive work too. So it's not that these skills, I mean, what I've seen is that most students need these pieces. It's just what you're using the blocks of time for to meet the needs of kids can vary, but it's following the same schedule as their peers too. So, okay, let's see, we've got lots of questions here. Let's see, I would love to hear the presenter's thoughts on considering how to increase access by actively planning to support student engagement and opportunities for choice during comprehensive literacy instruction. So who would be interested? Karen, you're shaking your head.
Yeah, I walked into a classroom today that had a teacher-made poster on the wall. That's a quote that I often say, which is, our job as teachers is not to make students do things. It's not to make students read, it's to make them want to. And how do we create learning opportunities that are motivating and interesting and engaging? And I think choice is a huge part of that. When we talk about conventional reading and writing instruction, we have our teacher-directed portion. That's going to be particularly our systematic, explicit approach to teaching phonics and spelling. We're going to have teacher-directed instruction where teachers are actively choosing texts and choosing purposes for reading in order to teach children how to comprehend the text that they're reading and listening to. But we also, as part of our comprehensive model, are having students engage daily in lots of reading and writing practice. And that reading and writing practice always involves student choice. So broad selection of texts that they can choose from to read, and broad notions of what counts as text. So we know that in today's world, we have lots of students who would much prefer to read digital text. We still have others who like a book. We have others who would read a graphic novel, but they wouldn't read something else. So building that choice in order to get that practice is a really important thing. And then making sure that students are supported in learning to write about topics they choose and ideas that they have. And that's particularly important for students with the most complex disabilities, who ultimately need to learn to use spelling and writing as a means of communicating with the world, because there's just no other way we could ever predict what it is that they want to or need to say. And so we need to be building that skill of having your own ideas and being able to write about them. So that engagement and opportunity for choice are really big parts of what happens every day as part of that comprehensive. And they get paired each day with very explicit teacher instruction around decoding, spelling, and comprehension.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that a little bit is the way that they can write, they can have some choice about that. Not every day has to be in the same mode, using the same method, or with the same type of product at the end. Additionally, they also can have some choice about how they're going about some of the instruction. So very common for students with autism, we use a first then, and that they can choose first what we're going to do, these kind of things first. And whether there's a group of things, whether we listen to the text first or we're going to work on decoding first, they can make some choices about that they feel some ownership of what's going on in even their schedules. So those are some other ways that we can build and embed choice within the literacy block about how it's executed.
So we just have a couple minutes left and a couple questions on resources. Are there any resources that would help literacy specialists in understanding the connection of this work with the science of reading?
That's a place for us to go in the future that I know from us. That is a place for us to go in the future. That I talked a little bit. I just mentioned Dr. Root's work about the evolution of the literacy model and incorporating some of those pieces for example, Scarborough's reading rope and those kind of things embedded into those models. That is the place for us to go. And we also know that working with literacy specialists in the school, they are the most connected to the teachers that are in those buildings. So if we can provide more information for the literacy specialists can then provide that information about instruction for special education teachers so that we're not siloed. Right now, many literacy specialists don't connect with the special ed teachers in those self-contained classrooms because they think they're in two different worlds. And we really like to make those connections. So that definitely is a place for our focus in the future, is to be able to bring those folks together.
And we've shared several links to our projects where each one of them has a annotated bibliography where you could dig in and see a little bit more. And then Ashley's presentation and my presentation included a link to at the risk of self-promotion, that my colleague and I wrote. And each of the chapters begins with a review of the literature that links what we know from science of reading and general ed and how it relates to students with significant disabilities in both emergent and conventional literacy. But if you go to our websites, you can get lots of that stuff that OSEP already paid for.
A lot of resources out there on the websites, which is terrific. So yeah. We have one here question, and it looks like it got cut off, and it's around some students. A high percentage are not receiving diplomas, and parents are requesting compensatory services that are not happening at the IEP level. Do you have resources for families? And then it gets cut off, so I'm not sure where that's going. But I can see
like
that
finished it. It looks like the second to last one is the second part of that comment.
Oh, got it. Okay. Boy, that's really okay.
So do you have resources
for family where they can access services for their child and learn more about this topic and stuff? So is there a parent center that's focusing on literacy, or do you have a component of that with either of them?
So I can say a few things about that. When the pandemic happened and everything shut down, our websites include a variety of very short, open source, accessible, self-directed training modules that we created for classroom staff, teachers, and then all of the support staff. And we had over 1,000% increase in the completion rate in the first 9 months of the pandemic. And about half of those people were parents. And so I would definitely be pointing parents to the professional development modules that are in each of our websites. Parents have repeatedly given us feedback that that's excellent. And then I'm pretty sure you said that you're in District 75. I would point you particularly to a particular program called Readtopia that I know some people in District 75 have used post-secondary really successfully. And again, during the pandemic, many families picked that up and used it independently to help their adolescent and young adult children who had started the pandemic as emergent readers and writers, who came back to school this past year with conventional reading and writing skills because their parents had no choice but to teach them every day. And that program seemed to offer them the level of support that they needed to be able to move forward. And I know that I believe that some of those families were in District 75. I know that the post-secondary teachers were.
Terrific. Okay, I think we are just 1 minute over, and I think we got through most of the questions. I really appreciate the questions that everybody asked. Wow, really, dug deep and got us thinking about things. So thank you for being here today. Thank you to our presenters. It's really such an important topic. We need to really elevate this work and having our kids with the most extensive support needs become literate and have that be a priority, just like it is for every other child who's in a school district. So thank you so much, and feel free. You can get our email us or through our websites, get hold of us if you have any other questions too. Thank you.